Hello, everyone. Man, it's been a while since I've done just one of these just talking things. Um, hello, everyone. Um, it's Andrew here for Barry History, and I thought, I can't let the 77th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge go by without any kind of acknowledgement. So I figured I'd do just one whole big live stream talking about the battle. Then I realized talking about the entire Battle of the Bulge was a lot because it is a very complicated, very large scale battle to talk about with a lot of different moving parts. So I decided I'd just focus on one single town in Belgium, everything that happened during the Battle of the Bulge, or most of the things that happened during the Battle of the Bulge around that town. And as you probably guessed from the title, focusing on the town of Bastogne, um, which has been made famous by the story of the 101st Airborne Division and its defense of the town in late December of 1944. But that's really tends to be the only story that we really hear about what went on in Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. And there is stuff that happens before the 101st shows up. There's stuff that happens after the 101st shows up, and there's even stuff happening while the 101st is there that doesn't pertain to the 101st Airborne. So we're going to talk about some of that stuff tonight. Um, so I guess we'll get right into it. I put together just a little collection of pictures. Let me pull that one up. There we go. So this is a very, very basic map of um, the Battle of the Bulge in its entirety. So as you can see, does the cursor show up? No, it doesn't show up. But right near that red line, denotes the German line, and you can see near the bottom of that little salient, or rather big salient, there is a small circle around a little blue dot, and that's the town of Bastogne. Bastogne was one of several crossroads towns in Belgium, in this area of Belgium, that was vital to any kind of advance by either army. Uh, so it made sense that there had to be troops holding that town prior to the Battle of the Bulge. Um, so before we get to the 101st Airborne, we have to get to just before the Battle of the Bulge begins. Um, this entire sector where Bastogne is situated at the time is being held by the 28th Infantry Division. Um, this was sort of their rest, but not rest. The 28th, just prior to being sent to the Ardennes, had been in the Hürtgen Forest, which was a very bloody battle for them. They got torn to shreds in the Hürtgen, as most units that got sent to the Hürtgen. And so after being pulled out of the Hürtgen Forest, they were sent to the Ardennes because it was a relatively quiet sector. It was still, somewhat important, but no one was really expecting there to be any kind of action uh, in this sector around, the beginning of winter 1944. Um, the Battle of the Bulge, the German offensive in the Ardennes in the winter of 44, caught a lot of people off guard. 28th was no different. So being one division, having to cover a very large section of land, um, only one regiment of the 28th was actually in Bastogne or near Bastogne. That's the 110th Infantry Regiment. And there's one of the handful of photographs of members of the 110th in Bastogne. This is after they've already been in combat after the initial assault by German forces. Now, just a little bit north of Bastogne, closer to St. Vith, was the 106th Infantry Division. And while the story of the 106th has relatively little to do with what goes on at Bastogne, um, part of the supporting units that were being sent up to help the 106th out um, end up in Bastogne. Among them is the 333rd Artillery Battalion, which will play into the story of the 101st Defense of the town in just a little bit. Also, um, among those support units, bringing supplies up to St. Vith and that general sector is the 4009th Quartermaster Truck Company. These are all black units. These are two all black units, and they will actually end up participating in the defense of Bastogne once the 101st Airborne arrives. Now, it's only 2 battalions of the 110th that are actually holding Bastogne. They're also being supported by armored units from the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions. But they are going up against multiple German SS Panzer and Grenadier units. So they are outgunned and outnumbered. It is around this time, just a couple days, just 1 or 2 days into what we know as the Battle of the Bulge, that Supreme Allied Command calls in its reserve forces. And among these reserve forces are the divisions of the 18th Airborne Corps, namely the 82nd and 101st Divisions, which had been in rear area camps resting after their very long campaigns in Holland. The 82nd will end up around St. Vith, and the 101st will be going to Bastogne. Now, with the 101st Airborne, there will be the remnants of the 333rd, whoever was able to get out of the trapped 106th area, as well as the 969th Artillery Battalion, which was the sister battalion to the 333rd, and also another all-black artillery battalion. These 2 artillery battalions are going to serve together throughout the duration of the war, and they will serve alongside, attached to the 101st Division throughout the duration of its time in the Ardennes. Is there a way? I'm going to see if I can zoom in on the actual. I clearly thought this through. Yeah. Nope. I'm a historian, not a tech person. Well, the 101st, as we know, are going to be surrounded. Let me get back to the slideshow. In Bastogne. And they're going to be surrounded and under siege for several days. They arrive around December 18th, 1944. They're going to be holding a very thin, very fragile perimeter around the town that is going to be pushed inward throughout the first couple days. Bastogne is going to be subjected to intense German artillery and armor attacks for a while. And if you've seen or read Band of Brothers, or watched the movie Battlegrounds, which is another piece of entertainment media that covers this episode in the history of the 101st. The 101st Airborne is cut off. They have very little supplies, very little winter clothing, they're low on ammunition, they're low on food, they're low on medical supplies. Their wounded can't be evacuated out of the combat area. So it's a very, it's very much a it's kind of an Alamo kind of situation. Um, and then, of course, this is actually one of only a few pictures of the 969th Artillery Battalion. This was taken during the Battle of the Bulge. This was featured in a book called Seven Roads to Hell that was written by a man who had served in Able Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He's actually one of the few books that actually mentions the service of the 969th. So they are cut off. They are running low on supplies. It gets to the point where, they have the 4 regiments, combat regiments of the division, in addition to a handful of artillerists from the 333rd, the 969th. They have the surviving members of the 4009th, which at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge was heading up to bring supplies to the 106th, and ran into the German advance and had to be pushed back all the way to Bastogne, where they basically picked up rifles and became riflemen. And then they're also, the division is also basically going to any non-essential personnel, rear echelon guys, and handing them rifles. And this all culminates into creating essentially an extra battalion that was called Team Snafu. For those who are unfamiliar with World War II GI slang, SNAFU is a little acronym that means situation normal, all fucked up. So the idea is if Team Snafu is going into combat, then shit has well and truly hit the fan. And this is what it's going to be like for the 101st and all its attached units. In addition to the extra artillery battalions and the 4009th Supply Company or Truck Company, there are also a handful of tank destroyers from the 750th. There are a handful of M18 Hellcats, which are light armored vehicles that were used for anti-tank operations. From the 705th and 609th tank destroyer battalions that were left over from the 9th and 10th armored divisions. So this story that the 101st Airborne had to single-handedly hold out against terrible odds, against unrelenting German assaults. It's not the most accurate. They do have all this extra support, and they're not on their own. That doesn't mean that it wasn't difficult for the 101st, but it wasn't just 4 regiments of paratroopers and a couple artillery pieces, and that's it. It's a lot more guys than that, a lot more firepower than that. But they're still going up against a much larger enemy force that has a lot more firepower. On this day, 77 years ago, the German commanders in the area actually sent a message to the acting commander of the 101st, General Anthony McAuliffe, who originally was just in charge of the division's artillery. And they demanded his surrender because they looked at the situation. They saw, this entire division of paratroopers surrounded, running low on pretty much everything, and said, hey, we'll spare the United States such a great loss if you all surrender right now. McAuliffe, the story goes that McAuliffe initially said out loud when he received this message, nuts, what the hell am I going to do? And one of his staff officers said, you should just say that, nuts. And so McAuliffe sent that was McAuliffe's reply, nuts. Became famous and was shared amongst the members, the men of the division out on the line, and they cheered. What's really interesting, though, is that the Germans, in their demands for a surrender, threatened an overwhelming artillery barrage if the demands were not met. And after McAuliffe responded with just nuts, there was no artillery barrage. There was a small attack that was supported by armored units, but that's it. What else do I have here? So relief did not come to the 101st Division until December 26th, 1944, when lead elements of George Patton's Third Army finally broke through the German perimeter and were able to make contact with the 101st Airborne. This tank right here is the first tank that made contact with the men of the 101st. Its call sign was Cobra King. And as you can see, they were very proud to be the first tank to arrive in Bastogne. The 101st made a point of refusing to acknowledge that they needed to be rescued by Patton. But given the circumstances that, even their extra support units that had been kind of ad hoc together were running out of supplies by that point, they didn't have much longer. So Patton really did save a lot of guys. And then, it also allowed the 101st Division's commander, Maxwell Taylor, to finally get to his division, resume command. Men of the 101st had hoped that this would mean that they would be rotated out of the line finally. But shortly after the siege of Bastogne was broken, orders were to continue the offensive, essentially, move forward. And for the next several weeks, the 101st Airborne, as well as the Third Army and several other attached units, continued pushing northward against the German assault. And so, beginning of January of 1945, Patton's Third Army begins its big counterattack out of Bastogne. And among those divisions that will be attached to this counterattack is actually my personal favorite, the 17th Airborne. They're actually attached to this offensive basically to cover the western flank of the Third Army. So they are sent up to Bastogne and kind of advance west of it, northwest of the city or the town. And they're basically there to, keep any kind of German counterattacks from surrounding the town again. This is actually the 17th Airborne Division's first time in combat in January 1945. And they're going to be on the line for several weeks and suffer roughly over 1,000 casualties during this time in January of 1945. In fact, at the time, the 17th Airborne consisted of 4 regiments: the 507th and 513th Parachute Infantries, and the 193rd and 194th Glider Infantry Regiments. By the end of the 17th Airborne's time in the Ardennes, they will actually lose the 193rd. It will be so depleted that the remnants of the 193rd and the remnants of the 194th will be combined into just one single regiment, the 194th. So this is going to be the 17th Airborne's first time in combat. It is also where the 17th Airborne earns its first Medal of Honor. The sergeant, I can never remember his name. Yes. Isidore Jackman of the 513th Parachute Infantry earns the division's first Medal of Honor uh, during the 17th Airborne's advance. They came under surprise, unexpected German armor assaults, which Third Army intelligence had said would not happen. Um, and so Jackman basically ran out in the middle of oncoming fire to grab a bazooka that several dead comrades had left behind, um, and single-handedly managed to turn back the German armor, but was unfortunately killed in the process. He would be the first member of the division to earn the Congressional Medal of Honor, although albeit posthumously. Is that all I got for? Yeah, that's all I got in terms of pictures. Now, when we think of the Battle of the Bulge, and we think of specifically the episode around Bastogne, we often do focus on the 101st Airborne. And it makes sense for a number of reasons. This is, the 101st Airborne Division's big moment in the spotlight. They had participated in two major airborne operations, in Normandy and in Holland, but they had been part of a much larger picture. Whereas at Bastogne, they are front and center, and so this is where they are dubbed by American newspapers as "quote unquote" the battered bastards of Bastogne. And so they become famous because of the role that they're playing at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. They're also, they're paratroopers. There's always been this obsession in popular media with paratroopers because, paratroopers, you'd strip away all like the general silliness that surrounds airborne reenacting and all that. Strip away all that stuff. Paratroopers are still cool. Not jumping out of a perfectly good airplane to go fight in overwhelming odds. That's still pretty cool, and people find that interesting. But that's not really an excuse for ignoring the stories of, the 110th Infantry Regiment, who suffers the initial assault of the Battle of the Bulge and Bastogne. It's not an excuse to ignore the men of the 333rd and 969th Artillery Battalions who continue fighting with the 101st Division while they're in the Ardennes. So, when 101st is advancing and retaking all that ground, places like Foy, north of Bastogne, their artillery support is coming from these units that had been fighting right alongside them during the siege of Bastogne. And the 333rd by itself actually receives a presidential unit citation for its role in the Battle of the Bulge. But in the popular narrative of what happens at Bastogne, we forget them. They get lost. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that 333rd, the 969th, the 4009th, these are all black units. And the history field for a very long time has had an issue with race. And so it is important to point out that these guys were there too. And then, because the story of the 101st kind of ends, at least in the Ardennes, about mid-January, people stop caring, or tend to stop caring about what's going on in the vicinity of Bastogne after the 101st Airborne is pulled off the line. I think it's safe to say that many people's perception of the role of the 101st Division during the Battle of the Bulge is largely influenced by the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers and the book by Stephen Ambrose of the same title, which, you know, just follows one single rifle company, one single company in the single regiment in the entire division. And after Foy, well, couple days after the recapture of Foy by the 506, the entire division is eventually moved out of the Ardennes, but there is still fighting going on uh, in that sector. In fact, the 17th Airborne isn't pulled off the line until the end of January. The only reason they're being pulled off the line at the end of January is because around this time, Allied commanders are planning what will become Operation Varsity, which will take place in March of 1945. Um, and so they're pulled off the line to start getting ready for that. Um, and so this is one of those instances where we have to kind of remember that there is a much larger picture. It's very easy to want to talk about just the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, but we have to remember it was not just the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and the story doesn't end when Patton shows up the day after Christmas. The story keeps going. 101st Airborne keeps fighting. More units are added to this battle, to this one of the most important battles of the Second World War. So yeah, that's all I really had, which is about as much as I planned to talk about. And I was planning on not doing like super long, but Kigar, thanks for being in the chat. Thank you, South Barry Pfeiffer, for also being in the chat. Kigar, thank you for adding those other members of the 17th who won Congressional Medals of Honor. There are a lot of great books written about this. Some are written specifically about this, the Siege of Bastogne and the ensuing engagements following the lifting of the siege. Seven Roads to Hell, which I mentioned earlier. Let me see if I can pull that up. Seven Roads to Hell by Donald Bergnett, which I'm fairly certain you can get that on archives.org for free, which I love archives.org. If anyone has never heard of it, great source of free books. But Seven Roads to Hell, Donald Bergnett served in Able Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He was actually at Foy at the beginning of the 101st Airborne's defense of Bastogne, and was part of the 1st Battalion's, the 1st Battalion of the 506th retreat from Foy very early on. And he writes about, hiding in a ditch as German tanks roll over the ditch and stuff like that. It's a very interesting read from someone who was actually there. And as I said earlier, his account is actually one of the few that directly mentions the role of the 969th Field Artillery Battalion. And something that's really great, I think, is that he takes the time to thank the 969th, and basically, says, we couldn't have done it without them. Another great book, and this pertains more to the role of the 17th Airborne, as well as partially, Patton's Third Army, is 4 Hours of Fury, which I've talked about so many times on all these live streams. But the first chapter of 4 Hours of Fury does talk about um, the counterattack out of Bastogne at the beginning of January and the role of the 17th Airborne in protecting the flank of the Third Army as it advanced northward. In addition to the 17th, they were also working with the 87th Infantry Division during that counterattack. Um, when you really take the time to go through the list of all these units that were at Bastogne over the course of the Battle of the Bulge, it's a very long list. And you have bits and pieces of some units, and then you have whole divisions being thrown into it, which really does say something about how important Bastogne was, and that whole sector was, to the Allies during the Battle of the Bulge. So I hope everyone who watched found this informative, thought it was interesting. Um, I hope some people learned something new. And if you haven't already followed Barry McHistory on Twitch or YouTube or Facebook or all of the above, please go ahead and do that. Because there will be more stuff like this down the line. I'm actually trying to do this more regularly, just like these 30 to 40 minute nighttime chats on Wednesdays. So yeah, and if you have anything that you want to see on these sorts of stuff, please let me know. This will also be, because it's being streamed on both Facebook and YouTube, there will be an archive up forever. Twitch, it only lasts for 14 days, but yeah, there's this will be up for anyone who is interested in seeing this further down the line. And I'm glad I was able to find a way to do something for the 77th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for everyone in the chat, especially South Battery Pfeiffer and Keegar. I'm probably be streaming sometime tomorrow night as well. That'll be more of a video game streaming, and I'll be exclusively on Twitch for those who watch my stuff on Twitch. So please feel free to tune into that and hang out in the chat. I love it when people hang out in the chat. It gives me some more things to talk about. And yeah, share this with your friends, because I hope to one day get that little viewer number up past 3. But I'm still happy with 3. I'm happy when anyone is here. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your night, or whatever it is that you're watching this.